Hi, it's Cynthia at Pretty Paper Blackbirds. Thanks for watching. Let's take a look at the stamp sets for today's card. I'll be using the Penny Black Halloween Gathering stamp set, which has a spooky tree that is perfect for my nighttime scene. I'm also bringing back that Simon Says stamp, Let's Spook Up Some Fun stamp set that I used in the last video. I'll use a few stamps and 2 sentiments from this set. For the panel on the front of the card, I'm using a layering weight white cardstock that I've trimmed to 4 3/8 by 3.5 inches. I'm also using a 2 3/8 inch diameter circle template that I've cut from Yupo. I've placed some low tack tape on the back so I can adhere this mask temporarily to my panel. I want to make sure I have perfect positioning for my moon, so I'm pulling in the spooky tree and the cat from the Penny Black stamp set, and I'm lining up these stamps to slightly overlap my moon mask. Later I'm going to create a hill for my cat to sit on as he's looking up at this moon. I'm using the My Favorite Things Stitched Snowdrifts die set, and this rolling hill die is the perfect die to create a mask for my hill. I'm making a few tiny adjustments to the scene, making sure my moon mask is secure, and I'm ready to start ink blending. For my night sky, I'm using Tim Holtz Distress Oxide inks in Prize Ribbon, Villainous Potion, and Rusty Hinge. I'm going to apply the ink with a blending brush, starting with my darkest color Prize Ribbon at the top, and I'm ending with Rusty Hinge at the bottom just above this hillside. I'm using a pencil to mark the border where I want each color to begin to blend into the next color. I'm doing this simply to remind myself where to stop and start the next color. Starting with Prize Ribbon, I'm applying the ink with a blending brush, and I want fairly heavy opaque coverage. This is a night sky, so I want that contrast between dark and light, and the heavier application really helps the moon to stand out. Next up is my favorite ink color for a nighttime sky, Villainous Potion. I want to make sure I don't have splotches with this dark ink color, so I'll start applying the ink just off the edge of the paper. I'm taking care that I blend the purple into the blue and that the area around the mask is fully covered. I'll bring back that Prize Ribbon and go over this margin area one more time to make sure my ink is well blended. For the last ink color in my background, I'm using Rusty Hinge. I'll apply the ink down to the point where the hill begins, again taking care to blend the purple and yellow ink by going over this transition area several times and alternating the 2 ink colors. I'm using less ink near the bottom of the panel to create the illusion that the sun has just set. I'll give this panel a few minutes to dry, and I'm ready to remove the mask. Look how the moon pops with these beautiful nighttime sky colors. I want to create the illusion of shadowy clouds on my moon, so I'm going to take the 2 blending brushes I just used. I'm going to wipe them lightly on a paper towel to remove most of the remaining ink, and I'm going to lightly go over the moon, starting on the outside edge and moving in toward the center. I'm also using the side of my brush to get a more defined line at the bottom of the shadow. I'm really loving this misty, shadowy cloud look and the contrast between the light and dark. Moving on, I want my moon to really stand out, so I'm going to use Tim Holtz Distress Mica Stain in Iron Gate to add some texture and some depth. I'm making sure I shake this bottle until the mixing ball inside moves freely and there's no mica sediment sitting in the bottom of the bottle. I also wipe the top of the bottle near the spray nozzle to make sure no ink has collected here. I'm using what I call the all-in spray method. I push down fully and firmly on the spray pump, and this results in mostly a mist of ink with a few small droplets. I love how this created the look of craters on this moon. The inking on my panel is dry, and the next step is to create the mask for the hill at the bottom of the panel. You can use any hill die that you have in your stash. I'm lining up the die on my cardstock to get just the right angle to show the base of the tree on the right, and also to elevate the cat to appear in front of the moon on the higher hill on the left. I will tape down my die using highlighter tape, and I'm ready to die cut my mask. I'll save the stitched die cut to use on a future wintry card, and I'm using the bottom die cut for my mask. I want to check that all of the elements fit nicely inside the window frame, so I'll bring in the Hero Arts Elegant Window die that I'll be using to cut the frame. I'm lining it up over my scene and I'm making any adjustments before I tape my hill mask to the panel. For the hillside, I'm using Tim Holtz Ranger Distress Oxide in Black Soot. This ink has a smoky look and it isn't too black, which I felt would distract from the overall color scheme of the card. I'm switching out to a larger blending brush in order to speed up the inking process, and I'm inking fairly heavily to create contrast between the rusty hinge glow of the sky and the darker hillside. I'll take a quick peek to make sure I have good edge to the inking and I'm satisfied with the results. So I'll remove the mask, do a quick cleanup of my craft mat, and move on to the next step in the card. Okay, the background inking for this card is complete and it's time for some stamping. For this card, I am using VersaFine Clair Pigment Ink in Nocturne. I'll be using my Misty to stamp my images on this inked panel. The Misty allows me to stamp the image multiple times, making sure that I get just the right amount of ink coverage. I'm bringing in these two stamps from the Penny Black set, putting the tree down in the valley and sitting the cat up on that little hill looking at the moon. I'm also going to bring in the largest bat from that Simon Says stamp set. I'll close the door to my Misty to pick up those stamps, and I'm ready to start inking with this Nocturne ink. I love this pigment ink. It's very rich, dark coverage, and I generally need to stamp only one time to get really good ink coverage. I've given the pigment ink a few minutes to dry and I'm ready to move on to some embossing. I'm going to start by going over the entire piece with my Pink and Main anti-static powder tool. I'm careful not to miss any spots because this is a very heavily inked background and it tends to attract and hold embossing powder. I'm going to use two different embossing techniques today, one using a Tim Holtz Distress embossing pen and the other using just a Versamark embossing pad. I want to add the impression of bark on the stamped tree, and I'll add this texture using the embossing pen and heat set embossing powder. I'm carefully tracing the branches of the tree, and for the trunk section, I'm drawing wavy lines that look like sections of bark. You can add knot holes, circles where the branches are missing. Your imagination is the limit here. I'm working quickly, but using only the very tip of the brush on the pen so as to create very thin lines within the outline of the stamp. I'm using Ranger Superfine Embossing Powder in black to emboss. It's one of my favorites. It works really well with detailed stamped images and it has a beautiful glossy finish after it's heat set. I'm applying the embossing powder all over the stamped area and I'm reapplying to any area that still appears shiny from the embossing ink. This is looking great, so I'm going to move on to the other stamps. I stamp the images twice with the embossing ink, making sure that my paper is in the exact same spot in the top left-hand corner of the Misty each time I stamp. I'll apply embossing powder to my images, making sure I have even coverage on both stamps, and I'm ready to heat set the embossing powder. I complete this step off camera. My heat tool is behind my main crafting table where I film, but you can see that the results are just beautiful. The bark texture on the tree brings another element to the card. Here are the two paper elements I'm using for the card. I have a patterned paper I'll use for my wallpaper. This patterned paper is from the Parklane Haunted Hollow collection. There are lots of amazing double-sided pieces of paper in this set. I also have a piece of layering weight craft cardstock that should be approximately 4 by 4 inches. Anything from your stash will do. To cut the window area from the wallpaper piece, I'll be using this 3 1/4 inch square die from the Recollections square nesting die set. This fits perfectly inside my window frame and gives just enough ledge around the perimeter to glue my window frame to the wallpaper piece. If you don't have this die set, you can use any square die that measures 3 1/4 inches. I've cut my window frame from the cardstock and I'm ready to create a sandwich that will help me line up the window die cut on the wallpaper piece. First, I place the window frame over the inked scene in the location that gives just the right view of the inked scene. I tape the frame into position so it doesn't move around while I'm creating the layers. Next, I'm placing that 3¼ inch square die cutting side up on the inside edge of the frame die cut. It should fit perfectly. I'll then place the wallpaper piece on top with the side of the pattern paper that I like facing down. That's my sandwich. Now I just carefully flip the entire sandwich over, remove the inked scene, and my window die is positioned perfectly on the wallpaper piece. I carefully tape the die down using a T-square ruler to make sure the die is level, but I'm being careful not to change the position of the die. Once I'm happy with the positioning, I can run this through my die cut machine. Next, I'm going to add some grunge and aging to the window frame and the wallpaper. I'm going to use that same Distress Oxide in black soot and a small blending brush to add slight color to a few areas of the window frame. I'm being careful not to apply it too heavily. I then place the window frame in my spray box and give a quick spray with that same Distress Mica stain and iron gate that I used in the night sky. This just gives the window frame a little more interest and contrast, and I like that grungy look as if this house might be old and haunted. I'll also add shading to the wallpaper around the window opening and in the corners, again being careful to apply the ink very lightly. I want the illusion of wear and aging. I'm using Tombow today to glue my window frame to the wallpaper piece. This should fit perfectly with a small 1/8 inch lip where I will apply the glue. I don't apply the glue to the mullion area. That's the inside area where the window panes meet. I'll leave that loose so there's extra dimension when this piece is adhered to the inked background. I use a very small amount of glue, small dots, so I don't have squeeze out when I press this onto the wallpaper piece. And here's another tip. Reverse tweezers are like little miracles when it comes to being able to see whatever you're gluing together. My wallpaper now has a window frame and I'm moving along to the card base. I'm using Hero Art's Hero Hues 111-pound cardstock in Eggplant for my card base. This paper is 8.5 by 5.5. I'm scoring at 4¼ to create an A2 card. I'm using my Teflon bone folder to get a nice crisp fold. I start by adhering the window layer to the inked background. Again, I like the dimension and the slight shadow cast onto the background by the grid in the middle of the window, so I won't apply adhesive to this area. I line everything up and give it a good press around the edges. I want to add additional interest to the wall, so I'm going back to the Simon Says stamp, Let's Spook Up Some Fun stamp set, and I'm going to stamp the larger spider in the top right. It will appear to be descending down the wall from the ceiling. I use the large spider because bigger is better when it comes to spiders at Halloween. I'll stamp the spider in VersaFine Clair Nocturne, just using a stamp block instead of pulling out the Misty. I'd like to say that's because I'm brave that way, but you can see that I tested out on a scrap piece of pattern paper before I actually stamp on my mostly completed card. Next, I'm creating a sentiment for my card. I'm using the Have a Wicked Good Halloween sentiment stamp from the Let's Spook Up Some Fun stamp set. I position my stamp in the Misty, and I'm using my anti-static powder tool to ensure I get a clean, crisp emboss on this heavy black cardstock. I'm using white detail embossing powder for my sentiment, and I'll use a paintbrush to remove any stray flecks of embossing powder. To die cut my sentiment, I'm using the longer, narrow die from the Spellbinders Sentiment Labels dies. I'm using only the inside portion of the die. I position the die over the label, taking care to align the die from each side. Once the alignment is perfect, I can tape the die down and run the label and the die through my die cut machine. At this point, I decide to trim down my card front so that I can adhere my sentiment to the card base instead of the card front. Sometimes during the creating process, I change my mind about a particular element or placement. I've learned to just go with the flow here. In this case, I really want more of the eggplant card base showing because I thought it would be a great background for the black sentiment strip, and also this purple pop of color helps to highlight the purple ink in the night sky. In another impromptu decision, I decide to add a spider web to the card front. The card's nearly finished at this point and the stamping's very close to the edge, so I'm going to use the Misty for this spider web. Again, I'm using VersaFine Clair ink in Nocturne for the stamping. I carefully line up the edge of the card at the 1-inch mark in case I need to reposition for a second layer of stamping. Okay, I'm finally ready to assemble this card. As I'm positioning the card front on the base, I decide that I'd like a little more of the eggplant card base to show around the window. I'm trimming down the panel by 1/16 of an inch on each side. I like how this shows a little bit more of the eggplant cardstock around the frame of this inked front panel. It really helps the purple in the night sky to pop. I'm going to use some foam tape to adhere the front panel and the sentiment to my card base. Anytime I'm mailing a card, I like to give it a little bit of extra sturdiness so it holds up well in the mail. All of the pieces to the card front are prepped and I'm ready to place them on the card base. I'll line up the front panel within that 1/16 inch frame that I created by trimming the panel down, and I'll line up the sentiment. I really like how the eggplant cardstock frames this window scene and it brings out the purple in the night sky. Overall, I'm very happy with the last minute creative additions to the card front. The last step for this card is to create an insert for my inside sentiment and a note for my recipient. For the insert, I'm creating a simple panel using some of the elements I used on the front of the card. First, I'll bring back that Distress Oxide black soot. I'm going to create a smoky gradient element at the top of the card. I'm using a light touch with the application and I'm keeping the inking very transparent and keeping it only to the top 1/4 of the panel. I've placed my ink panel in my Misty and I'm arranging the spider web stamp and my sentiment on the panel. I'm using the sentiment "Let's Spook Up Some Fun," and both of these stamps will be stamped in that same VersaFine Clair ink in Nocturne. I'm also going to stamp that large spider from the front of the card. I'm switching to Villainous Potion Distress Oxide ink for the spider so we have some contrast and added interest in this panel. I'm stamping this twice so it's nice and opaque and it really stands out. All that's left to do is adhere the insert on the inside of my card. I'm using the Gina K tape roller. It's one of my favorites for adhering panels, and I love the finished look of this card. I hope you've enjoyed this second video in my Halloween series. If you'd like to be notified when the next 2 videos are released, please be sure to subscribe.